Hello, I'm Scott Thompson, and welcome to After 10. Korea was the first Asian country to actively encourage refugee laws, and its role on refugee issues is growing, with the nation now chairing the Executive Committee of the United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. On today's After 10, we are joined by the representative for UNHCR Korea, Dirk Hebecker, for more on Korea's growing role and its role moving forward. December 3rd marks 21 years since Korea ratified the Refugee Convention. Korea has shown a lot of progress this year on refugee issues. The Refugee Act was established this past June, and in July, the first ever refugee law in Asia started to be enforced. In May, UNHCR High Commissioner Antonio Guterres highly praised the enforcement of Korea's refugee law. In October, Korea's responsibilities grew even more, as it was elected to chair the Executive Committee of the UNHCR. We will take a look at the pending issues regarding refugees that Korea will now set its sights on. Back at the studio, we meet with the representative of UNHCR Korea, Dirk Hebecker. Mr. Hebecker, thank you very much for being on the program.
Thank you for having me.
Now, this month marks the anniversary month of the founding of the UNHCR. For our viewers, please, if you would, give us a little bit of a background about the when and why the organization was established.
Well, UNHCR was established in 1950. At the time, in order to deal with refugees that were still displaced in different countries in Europe after World War II. 1950, 5 years after the war, a lot of displacement had taken place during the war. Governments were still not able to adequately protect, assist, and most importantly, find durable solutions, long-term solutions for those refugees as a result of World War II. And the UN decided to create a specialized UN agency, at the time just a one-man show, basically the High Commissioner with the secretary and a driver. But quickly the organization expanded. Initially the organization only had a 3-year mandate to solve the problem of European refugees after World War II. But as UNHCR was doing that job, new refugee situations also came up in different parts of the world as the result of the beginning of the Cold War, but also the collapse of colonial empires, conflicts in Africa and Asia. And so UNHCR became a more permanent global organization, not just for the refugees in Europe.
And it's evolved over the years. Fast forwarding to today, tell us what the UNHCR is focusing its efforts on and all of the countries that it is in throughout the world.
Well, UNHCR is present in over 120 countries. We have about 200 locations because UNHCR is not just working out of capitals, but we work where the refugees are, and they are in many different refugee camps or settlements. We today cater for about 45 million displaced people, not only refugees, but also internally displaced people, people who are also displaced as a result of conflict or human rights violations, but have not crossed an international border, still within their own countries, but also stateless people, people without a citizenship for which UNHCR is also mandated to assist and find durable solutions. Today, UNHCR is obviously prominently involved in the major humanitarian crises such as Syria, Congo, Sudan, Mali, many others, but is also still struggling with older refugee situations, as we call them, protracted, where refugees have been in displacement for a number of years, some as long as 20, 30, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and a number of other countries.
And if you had to explain what the UNHCR is doing on the ground to help these refugees, how would you explain that?
Well, UNHCR's mandate is to protect and assist and to find durable solutions. What we do is we work with governments to provide basic assistance to cover basic needs for refugees' survival. At the same time, we also mobilize the refugee community to take lives into their own hands because refugees are not just passive recipients of aid. They also have their capacities, their teachers, their engineers, their workers, and refugees don't just want to receive assistance, they want to do something. Even though they're in exile, in displacement, it doesn't mean that they don't want to live a life in dignity, and so they want to work. Another part of our mandate is to find durable solutions for refugees. That means we work with governments to bring about political solutions for conflicts or to work on issues such as human rights violations in their countries of origin to enable refugees to return. And if that is not possible, to work with host countries to see how refugees can be integrated there, and in much smaller numbers, but we also work with third countries to have refugees resettled there if they cannot return and also not settle in the country where they are.
Turning our focus now to the organization that you are the representative of, UNHCR Korea. Tell us a little bit about when and why it was formed and some of the projects that the organization is currently working on here.
Okay. UNHCR Korea is basically a representative office as a result of Korea joining the 1951 Refugee Convention, the convention relating to the status of refugees. Korea joined this convention in 1992, and initially with amendments to the Immigration Act, but more recently with the introduction of a comprehensive refugee law. Korea has not just signed the convention, but also lived up to its obligations by accepting refugees, asylum seekers and refugees into the country. So in the mid-90s, initially UNHCR embedded one person within another UN office, the larger UN office here. Later, a self-standing UNHCR office was created. Precisely in 2006, we opened a representation here to assist the government in improving its way of dealing with asylum seekers and refugees in the country, but also, and that is the second big task UNHCR Korea has here, to mobilize Korea, the Korean public, the government, to become more proactive in supporting the international refugee cause.
Mobilizing support would be one aim for the branch here. In terms of issues that are related to South Korea and the Korean Peninsula, what are some of the more pressing issues that UNHCR Korea is trying to tackle?
There are a number of challenges that Korea is going through in basically what we would call the birth pangs of refugee protection in Korea. How to deal with asylum seekers from different countries, how to determine whether they're indeed refugees or not, how to make sure that they're reasonably well integrated, supported, protected here in Korea. Also to make sure that international standards are followed on the reception and treatment of refugees and asylum seekers. So we have a support role in that. We work with the Korea Immigration Service, which has a refugee division, newly formed in June this year. We also work with the lawyers community, Korean Bar Association, and civil society and academia to make sure that the process is not just between government and refugees, but also has the support of civil society, who has become very active and proactive in also doing its bit to support refugees.
And in terms of numbers and I suppose the type of people who are seeking refuge, seeking asylum here in South Korea, who are they, and again, in what sorts of numbers are we seeing?
The refugee caseload here, as we would call it, in Korea is comparatively small. If we look at numbers of displacement worldwide, Korea only receives a tiny, tiny fraction, about 1,000 people every year who seek asylum, of which only relatively small numbers are accepted, maybe between 100 and 200 out of the 1,000 every year. And basically what we witness here is the same patterns of seeking refuge in Korea as we would see in Europe or in other industrialized countries.
When you hear about the refugee situation or the word refugee and South Korea in the same sentence, most people, I think, would think of North Korea. How does that factor into what the UNHCR Korea does, and what is the reality of that situation?
Well, first of all, North Korean defectors, as they're called here, are in general also considered by UNHCR as refugees. But in accordance with Korean national legislation, the constitution, every Korean is a Korean citizen. And so as soon as a North Korean defector is able to reach South Korea, he would be given citizenship. And if a refugee is able to avail himself of the protection of a government by attaining citizenship, he's no longer a refugee. That's why UNHCR has very little involvement with North Koreans in South Korea.
And I know UNHCR works very closely with the Korean government. What is the Korean government doing to help refugees who may want to eventually settle in Korea?
Well, Korea has been very proactive. As I said, in 1992, the Refugee Convention was ratified by Korea. Since then, Korea has gone a long way to map out strategically a system that we would call the National Refugee Protection System. We now have a comprehensive law, which is one of the most progressive in the region, definitely, but also worldwide compares very well to refugee laws in other countries. Now the task is to implement this law well. The law also has provisions not only for integration and protection assistance to refugees who have sought asylum in Korea, but it also has provisions for enabling refugees from other refugee crises around the world to eventually settle in Korea at the invitation of Korea. We call this a resettlement program, which is quite common in a number of countries like the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the European community. Some Scandinavian countries have been very active in sharing the refugee burden, basically, with those countries that are in the vicinity of conflicts, such as Jordan, Lebanon, Turkey, in the Syria crisis today. So Korea entering the international refugee protection family now is also considering to open its doors to refugees from such situations.
You mentioned the resettlement program of Korea that is just now getting its feet on the ground. What advice does and can the UNHCR give to the Korean government as it tries to enact this system?
Yes, I think Korea is only now contemplating to prepare the ground for such a program. It is part of the refugee law. There's a legal provision for that to happen. But there are lots of practicalities that need to be considered, and where Korea is at the moment studying the experience of other resettlement countries in the region, but also globally, to figure out how this program should be set up in the case of Korea. Korea is making good progress on designing the, let's say, standard operating procedure, from selecting refugees to preparing refugees to come to Korea, but then also for the reception and integration of refugees from different countries here. In the case of some other countries who have recently started such programs, the preparatory phase can take as long as a few years. So I think Korea is going through that right now. It is a bit unpredictable when actually the first refugees will benefit from such a program.
And Korea really, in this region, is really trying to blaze a trail with regard to refugees. It did in July, this past July, pass the Refugee Act, becoming the first Asian country to do that, to pass an act like that. You mentioned it earlier. Tell us a little bit more about the act and what it aims to do.
Well, as I said, the Refugee Act in itself is a remarkable event. As you were saying, it is the first such comprehensive, self-standing act encompassing refugee protection, treatment of asylum seekers, and even including resettlement of refugees from other refugee crises in the world. It is probably too early to judge how good or bad this law is because it is only a few months since its adoption. There are also probably still a number of gaps that the government of Korea is still struggling to fill in order to fully implement this law. But by and large, I think what the law means to UNHCR and to refugee protection in the world is that Korea has now fully lived up to its obligations under the 1951 Refugee Convention. It has made a statement by issuing a legal instrument that makes all these things possible. Now it is in the process of setting up everything for the law to be fully implemented. UNHCR is here to help that process.
And you're meeting with government officials and various officials throughout the government that work on these issues. Why Korea? Why, when you look at the landscape of Asia, why was Korea the first one to really take the first step on imposing a Refugee Act from your sense of these discussions?
Well, I think it has a lot to do with Korea's general efforts to put itself on the international map. Signing international treaties and living up to the obligations under such treaties has been a trend over the last 15, 20 years in Korea. If you look at what conventions have been ratified and joined by Korea. So for refugee protection, I think it is quite clear that Korea has an interest to do more, both politically but also financially, to support the international community, to share the burden that until now mostly the big industrialized countries have been taking. Korea joining the top 20 of the world's economic development now also realizes it needs to do more politically and internationally, including the refugee cause.
And the government is, again, taking steps to help out refugees who may be seeking asylum here in Korea. They recently established a refugee support center in Incheon, Yeongjongdo. What role will that center play when it opens for refugees who want to stay in Korea?
Yes, I think the new refugee support center in Yeongjongdo in Incheon is actually part of the implementation of the Refugee Act. If you have a government policy of receiving and integrating refugees in Korea, you need to have some kind of support system in the very beginning. People come here, they don't speak the language, they don't know the society, they don't know the do's and don'ts for foreigners in Korea. It was equally difficult for me first to understand many things that are different in Korea than from other countries where I've been working or my own country. I figured it out myself or with the support of my colleagues, but for refugees who come here fairly unprepared, I think the Refugee Support Center will play a very important role in, first of all, dealing with refugees' initial trauma, why they came out from where they arrived from, but then also going through medical checkups, go through language training, familiarization with Korean society, culture, customs, also some initial assistance and perhaps getting some vocational training if they don't come with a vocation or profession. Then also some support to set up their life accommodation in Korea, how to set up a bank account, how to find a job, etc., those things. And in fact, I visited Yeongjongdo Island last week and had the opportunity to be taken around. The center is basically ready for receiving the first group of refugees. And I think officials there are very much looking forward to receiving the first batch. I found a lot of similarities of this center with similar facilities in many countries in the world, which I've seen. This one is state of the art. I have to say I was really impressed. It is super conditions for refugees, definitely catering for all the different things that we would ask the government to pay attention to, like separate protection for women, for example, also some facilities for the children, also for the center not to be a completely closed kind of prison-like fortress facility, but a very very normal kind of school with a hostel attached to it. Very pleasant experience for me to see that.
In looking at Korea's growing role, it's growing really globally, internationally. The representative of South Korea's permanent mission to the United Nations in Geneva in October became the chair of the executive committee for the UNHCR, that being Chae Suk-young. What role does the UNHCR expect from Korea, now with the chair being from Korea, moving forward in the future?
Well, UNHCR has its general expectations on the chair of the executive committee. There's no particular expectation from the chair being from a particular country, but we know Ambassador Choi for many years in his capacity as the permanent representative of the Republic of Korea at the United Nations in Geneva. He's a very skillful, experienced, mature diplomat with a lot of experience in the international arena. He's an excellent negotiator. And I think with Korea taking the chairmanship, especially under the leadership of Ambassador Choi, a number of issues that are problematic at the international level regarding refugee protection will be tackled very well and professionally by Ambassador Choi. We, of course, hope that in a way the Korean public also becomes more aware through this role Korea will be playing for 1 year at the Executive Committee, UNHCR's governing board, about refugee issues worldwide, because the support by a country like Korea, which has entered the top 10, 15 countries economically in the world, is expected to do more financially, politically, to support refugees worldwide.
Mr. Hebecker, certainly important issues that we're talking about here. Thank you for being here, providing insights on Korea's growing role on refugee issues worldwide. We appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
And thank you, as always, for watching. We'll see you next time after 10.